Today, we're going to break down the story of Benito Mussolini and the rise and fall of fascism in Italy. We'll be sticking to the facts, following a clear timeline of the key events, and really looking at the political systems he built and ultimately the consequences of his time in power.
So, how did a figure like Mussolini even get a foothold? Well, you really have to picture Italy right after the First World War. The country was technically on the winning side, but it was an absolute mess. The economy was in shambles, politics were chaotic, and there was this constant simmering fear of a communist revolution. This created a power vacuum, just waiting for a leader who could promise to bring back order, no matter the cost.
All right, here's how we're going to walk through this. We'll start with Mussolini's dramatic ideological shift, then cover how he seized power. After that, we'll look at how he built the fascist state, his foreign policy ambitions, the collapse during World War II, and finally, his death and lasting legacy.
So let's start at the beginning, and here's the thing that might surprise you. Mussolini didn't start out as a fascist, not even close. His early political life was actually the total opposite of what he'd become famous for. And understanding that transformation is key to the whole story.
He was born back in 1883, and his father was a socialist blacksmith, so those revolutionary ideas were around him from the very start. He became a pretty prominent figure in the Italian Socialist Party, making a name for himself as a journalist and an agitator. He was so influential that by 1912, he was the editor of the party's official newspaper, Avanti, where he was writing against capitalism and war.
And wow, did he change his tune fast. The big catalyst was World War I. In a complete reversal, he started arguing that Italy should join the war. This got him kicked out of the Socialist Party in 1914. His experience serving in the army then cemented his new nationalist beliefs. And by 1919, he'd founded the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento. That word, fasci, it refers to a bundle of rods, an old Roman symbol of authority that means strength through unity.
So, with this new nationalist fire, what's the next step? Seizing power, of course. But this wasn't your typical armed revolution. Instead, Mussolini was an expert at exploiting the chaos and weakness of the state, using a mix of street violence and clever political moves to take control. You know, a movement like fascism doesn't just pop up out of nowhere. The conditions in Italy were, well, they were perfect for it. You had the post-war instability and that deep fear of communism. Mussolini's paramilitary squads, the Black Shirts, used violence to crush socialists and labor unions, which actually won him support from powerful industrialists and landowners who were terrified of a leftist takeover. This all came to a head in October 1922 with the so-called March on Rome. It was really more of a political bluff than a military invasion. As thousands of his fascist supporters gathered outside the capital, the government completely panicked. The king, worried about starting a civil war, made a critical decision. He refused to call in the army, and instead just invited Mussolini to become prime minister. So he took power legally, but with the very clear threat of force hanging over everyone's head.
So he's prime minister, but he doesn't just flip a switch and become a dictator. No, it was a slow, deliberate process. Over the next few years, he worked methodically to take apart every single democratic institution in Italy, step by step, until he'd built a full-blown totalitarian state.
A huge turning point came in 1924. A socialist leader, Giacomo Matteotti, stood up in parliament and publicly condemned the fascists for their violence and for rigging elections. Shortly after, he was murdered. The scandal could have been the end of Mussolini, but instead, he used it to seize even more power. By 1925, he had banned all other political parties and declared himself Il Duce, the leader.
So how did he maintain that iron grip on power? Well, he had a whole toolkit of control. Italy became a one-party state, so there was no political opposition. He imposed strict censorship on the press. State propaganda was everywhere, building this cult of personality around him. And of course, there was a secret police force to crush any dissent.
On the economic side of things, Mussolini rolled out something called the corporate state. He pitched it as this revolutionary third way between capitalism and socialism. But what it really was a system for total government control over the economy. Independent unions were outlawed, strikes were banned, and every part of the economy was directed by the state.
Okay, so he's locked down control in Italy. Now what? He starts looking outward. He had these grand dreams of restoring a modern Roman Empire, and this obsession with imperial glory would eventually push him into a deadly alliance with Nazi Germany.
The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 was a really big deal. The rest of the world condemned it, which kind of isolated Italy from the Western democracies and pushed it right into the arms of Hitler's Germany. This led to the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936. Then, to get even closer to Germany, Italy adopted its own anti-Semitic racial laws in 1938. And finally, in 1939, they signed the Pact of Steel, a formal military alliance that sealed Italy's fate with Germany's.
And that alliance? It turned out to be the worst decision he could have made. It's what brought the whole thing crashing down. When Italy jumped into World War II in 1940, all the weaknesses that had been covered up by years of propaganda were suddenly exposed for the world to see, leading to a surprisingly fast collapse.
For years, fascist propaganda was all about Italy's amazing, modern, and powerful military. It was a huge part of their image. But here's the thing. It was a complete myth. The truth was, Italy was totally unprepared for a major war, and that huge gap between the myth and the reality became painfully obvious almost immediately.
And the failures just piled up. I mean, Italian forces were getting hammered in North Africa. Their invasion of Greece was an absolute disaster that they couldn't finish on their own. Their campaigns in the Balkans were a mess. Over and over again, German troops had to step in and bail out the Italians. It just shattered that whole myth of fascist military might.
The end came, and it came fast. In July 1943, the Allies successfully invaded Sicily. This defeat on Italian soil was the final straw. Within weeks, even his own fascist Grand Council turned on him and voted him out of power. The king then ordered his arrest, and just like that, after 2 decades, the fascist regime collapsed.
But just when you think it's over, it's not. German commandos pull off this dramatic rescue of Mussolini from prison. They then set him up as the leader of a new puppet state in northern Italy. But let's be clear, he was a leader in name only, completely controlled by the Germans, as the rest of Italy descended into a brutal civil war.
And that brings us to the final chapter, Mussolini's death and what he left behind. In a way, his end was just as violent as the ideology he had created.
In the last days of the war in Europe, Mussolini tried to make a run for it, to escape to Switzerland. But he was captured by Italian anti-fascist partisans. On April 28, 1945, they executed him without a trial. His body was then taken to Milan and put on public display. A very grim and definitive end to the fascist era. So what was the fallout from all this? Italy was just shattered, politically fractured, economically destroyed, and morally broken. And while fascism itself was discredited on the world stage after 1945, the system of total state control that Mussolini perfected, well, that became a blueprint for other authoritarian regimes that came later.
There's a quote that I think really sums up the whole story of his rule. He promised stability, but he delivered repression. He promised strength, but he left ruin. The entire system he built had no room for self-correction, which meant when it failed completely.
And this all leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. Mussolini's story is a powerful case study, really. It forces us to ask, when leaders promise to bring order, what is the true cost of that control?